Picture this: a Nintendo Direct shadow drops in June or July. Shigeru Miyamoto appears at the front of the show to thank people for enjoying the Super Mario Galaxy movie and the 40th anniversary celebrations for Super Mario Bros., and then goes on to explain that this year another beloved property is celebrating its 40th anniversary, and then the screen goes to not Zelda, but Metroid. Cue a block of Metroid announcements, a proper Metroid blowout. Yes, at the end, Miyamoto also confirms that there will be a celebration for Zelda, but please wait for more information on that. But for now, he's either handing back to Koizumi for the rest of the show, or conceivably, this is actually a full-on bespoke Metroid Direct, and any other content is to come in a separate presentation entirely, possibly not even until September. Why am I positing this as it seems so obviously mad? Well, there are a few reasons. First of all, it is Metroid's 40th anniversary this year. Now, Nintendo doesn't always acknowledge anniversaries, and traditionally I think we've always expected it to be crowded out by the Mario and Zelda celebrations. Plus, of course, Pokemon is also celebrating a big anniversary this year. However, the anniversaries are good marketing opportunities if Nintendo want to exploit them, and so if they wanted to try to bootstrap Metroid into the big leagues, now might be as good a time as any to give it a tilt. Indeed, the specific anniversary date this year falls on a Thursday, Nintendo's traditional day to release games. Its anniversary is actually in August, so it could liven up a fallow period for the company, and it has a horror vibe which chimes well with Japan's spooky season, while also taking advantage of the fact that this traditionally sales fallow season in Japan wouldn't be too much affected by the release of a title which doesn't have much market penetration in Japan. Splatoon Raids is more than capable of holding down the fort for Nintendo in terms of hype for their domestic market until September, and so you could absolutely imagine a situation where they have a big Metroid blowout which is mostly focused on raising the salience of the console and the property in the West, while having not so much of a focus in Japan, but letting Raiders take the lead. This also allows Nintendo to justify pushing back a Zelda focus to September, which I think would be far nicer for them in terms of their scheduling of a big block of dedicated marketing time around Zelda, which would then last through this holiday and along to the movie in April. This would allow Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave to fall into September alongside the other Zelda stuff, where it might find a better degree of cross-promotional benefit, given that Fire Emblem is a more swords and sorcery type world. If they move on to Zelda this June, it strikes me that a year-long celebration of Zelda might be slight overkill and might risk losing their focus a little bit as time goes by. Therefore, I think there is still a very strong possibility that we don't see anything significant in terms of Zelda until September, which means there is a window during which they might prioritize Metroid. Now, Metroid also, as a property, is not in rude health. Dread was fairly successful and definitely benefited from the Switch effect, but it was also a launch title for the Switch OLED and released in the peak Nintendo period of 2021, so some level of additional success was always going to be baked in, or at least hoped for. Remastered and Metroid Prime 4, though, have shown no signs of capturing the same spark, and Prime 4 almost certainly lost money for them, at least up until the current point. However, I do think Nintendo want to try to sell a Metroid film series. It's the big shot the property has to reach escape velocity. Remember how Tears of the Kingdom released in May 2023, and then a few months later we got confirmation that the ink was wet on a Zelda movie deal. I think Nintendo may want to try and engineer something similar with Metroid. They want a proof of concept that Nintendo has the potential to drive attention. Metroid Prime 4 should have been that, but it clearly wasn't, but Nintendo definitely isn't done with their commitment to the property. If they can engineer a massive Metroid push now, they can either use it as a proof of concept of the success of the Metroid series, or indeed, they could use it as a place to confirm that a Metroid film is in development. At the very least, it's hard to imagine Metroid 6 isn't in some advanced state of completion, and how do you give it the biggest possible launch if not by utilizing the rare opportunity of a major anniversary and of a relative gap in Nintendo's schedule? If Metroid were healthier, I think that they could afford to be a bit more relaxed about all this. They just find a slot for Metroid 6, chug it out, wait for the plaudits. But I think right now the thing to do would be to make maximum noise. We saw this with Pikmin 4. Pikmin was not a big property for Nintendo, but by leveraging Pikmin Bloom, the release of Pikmin 1 Plus 2, and a massive blitz of merchandising down to Pikmin-themed sandwiches in Japan, they were able to create a real groundswell around Pikmin, and so Pikmin 4 has become a pretty successful title for them. Now feels like a great time to do the same for Metroid. They may even see it as a great title to advertise to Star Fox fans. If you like this narrative-based sci-fi adventure, what about Metroid? And if you think they wouldn't release games that could be perceived as having similar qualities too close together, consider Animal Crossing New Horizons Nintendo Switch 2 edition, Percopia, and Tomodachi Life Living the Dream, all releasing in a 3-month window at the beginning of this year. All of the games having a similar kind of casual, cozy, social feel to them, and all titles that could have competed with each other, but also could be perceived to have complemented each other and have created a natural chain of purchases for people who are generally interested in this kind of game. So, if Nintendo wanted their Metroid moment, what would it entail? The most obvious one will be Metroid 6's announcement. I've talked before about whether Nintendo will go with another 2D entry or try something a bit more like Other M again, in gameplay terms rather than narrative, I'd imagine. But either way, the next Metroid will be a significant event game, and I think will be at the heart of their showcase. There are other low-hanging fruits though, just like Pikmin 1 and 2 were for Pikmin back in 2023. Most obviously, Dread and Prime Remastered have yet to receive any Nintendo Switch 2 upgrades, and yet both are absolutely beautiful titles that would benefit from it massively. Raising the salience of these games would make a lot of sense, and they could do what they did with Xenoblade Chronicles X and indeed with Prime Remastered originally, and have the physical releases trail sometime after the digital downloads of the patches. Either of these or both would be significant releases. And then there's Metroid Prime 4. Many Nintendo games get a whirl of free DLC to raise their profile after a few months. Dread did, and I think Metroid Prime 4 may too, especially since it was pointed out recently in the comments that it hasn't even received small bug fixes, and so this may indicate a more substantial upgrade is being developed. A boss rush mode and an option where all the green crystals count triple to your count is probably the kind of scale we're talking here, something to challenge diehards and something to address some of the criticisms with the game at launch. I definitely think it has to be a priority for them to try to make the most of this title, given that it is a highly prestigious series, a great graphical showcase for the Switch 2, and it is one of the relatively few major titles from the Switch 2's game library, and so they're going to want to focus on it. Then there's the potential of other older titles being revived. One rumour that has gained traction in recent months is a pixel remake of a past title such as Super Metroid. If true, this would make sense in certain respects. It would fit the trend we saw with good feel of Nintendo's satellite studios doing not just one game at a time, but two. It would also be bound to sell well with a far higher potential profit margin than many such games, and it would be a way of keeping Metroid going with similar remakes of Fusion and Zero Mission down the line. One assumes that a pixel version of this would be slightly cheaper to produce, and once the expertise is in place, they could release these relatively inexpensively compared to full-on remakes of the type of Samus Returns. Speaking of Samus Returns, that game is still trapped on the dear old 3DS. Now, I don't know I expect to see it just yet because it would be a far more substantial piece of work to bring this over to Switch 2, and this might clash too much with the development for Metroid 6. So I think this is something that will remain on the 3DS for the time being. Still, with Metroid 6 and either a pair of Nintendo Switch 2 editions or even a new version of Super Metroid or something else, or even all of these together, you could imagine a truly packed August for Metroid being put out there. Then there's the potential of other merchandise, which has always been at the heart of other anniversaries in recent times. Obviously, Metroid merchandise is a little trickier to speculate on than Mario or Zelda. I'm not sure Metroid Lego sets are exactly what we'd expect, although you never know. But some kind of prestige book along the lines of the Retro book last year could be a big announcement, especially with Sakamoto around the point of retirement and perhaps being able to look back over the history of the series in a major way. I wouldn't completely put it past Nintendo to do something weird in their toy line as well. We had Talking Flower and Alamo, and I think Nintendo sees its future as well served by expanding into toys again. Is there something they could do with a Samus visor? I don't even mean a VR type experience, but some kind of AR thing where you put it on and see what appears to be X-ray vision showing people's skeletons and all sorts of other strange effects. This might be too expensive as a discrete device, but perhaps as a phone app, it's something that they may see potential for. These off-kilter kinds of things may seem strange to us, but Nintendo likes to make lots of small bets, and we know that occasionally these pay off in disproportionate ways. Another weird option would be to emulate what Mario did for its 35th and do a Metroid 40 style game. Developers Arika are overdue a game, as their last title was Endless Ocean Luminous 2 years ago, and usually they focus on smaller, quirkier titles like Dr. Mario. A Metroid 40 seems like it could have an interesting appeal. Imagine if you entered a procedurally generated 8-bit maze with dozens of power-ups dotted around to allow you to progress, and you had to race against other Samuses to achieve the goal. Or, and here's a pivot that will be bound to irritate the Miles McKenzie haters out there, what about a multiplayer 2D Metroid? If Nintendo wants to try to push Game Chat, a title where you need to explore and talk to a friend as you go to solve puzzles could be a good model of the idea. If they were making a modern version of a pixel Metroid, it stands to reason that either as a game mode or as another game using the same core mechanics, they could develop something that utilized multiplayer. In terms of release windows, I imagine we'd be looking pretty squarely at August, as I don't think Nintendo would want to spread the Metroid focus too widely, because ultimately it's not the most significant property for them. For a long time, Nintendo hasn't done retail releases in August until the very end of the month, and while all bets are off this year, given how busy was their April, another frequently quiet period over recent years, I'd still say Metroid 6 on the 27th of August, or possibly the 3rd of September, is plausible. If I were to pick between the two, I would still say the 27th of August, because I think Nintendo will want to have a game that releases in the West prior to the price hike. However, if they were confident with pushing Metroid after the price hike, then the 3rd of September would be another sensible date. I think something, a Metroid 40 perhaps, would be likely for the 6th of August anniversary slot though, and Nintendo Switch 2 editions could release earlier digitally, with the physical releases coming alongside Splatoon Raiders in late July, the same kind of tactic they used with the Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition Nintendo Switch 2 edition, releasing physically on the same day as Tomodachi Life Living the Dream, a technique I can only imagine they decided on because shipping the titles together is more cost efficient, and if the digital release is already out, then there's not really a risk of the promotional cycles of the two games clashing. One anti-hype announcement could be Metroid Prime 2 on Nintendo Switch Online, since I think they must know by now that this would be seen, and indeed would be, as a tombstone on the hopes of another Metroid Prime remastered title. If they wanted to sweeten that bitter pill, this juncture is probably the best opportunity they could do it, but I still wouldn't rule out the possibility of Metroid Prime 2 Remastered. Despite the poor performance of both prior Switch Primes, I do have a separate video currently on the Patreon, which will come here in due course, which examines why I think it is slightly more likely than you might imagine that we could see something more from Metroid Prime 2. The question to me then is whether Nintendo indeed does want to go for a big Metroid blowout, and if so, is Metroid best served by being part of a bigger, jazzier Nintendo Direct, or as a discrete, shadow-dropped Metroid Direct? The series struggles for auction and publicity at the best of times, and being announced alongside a potential major 3D Mario is unlikely to benefit it. However, the series may never have more eyeballs on it than the first 10 minutes of such a long-anticipated Direct, and so I suspect that this is probably the slightly better spot for it. However, if they don't have a major Direct in June, it would allow Nintendo to plausibly push that Direct until September, when they have to go all out. On the other hand, what I think is more likely perhaps is that they have some smaller announcements alongside Metroid in June, plus a major Mario announcement, and then do a big blowout for Zelda in September, alongside some announcements linked to the early part of the next fiscal year. But one thing that makes me think that they're planning to go all out in September anyway is that this is when their US price hike kicks in. Therefore, they could expect an uptick in sales during August anyway, something they could use as evidence of a Metroid spike in their movie negotiations if they wanted to. But then, to avoid a September slump, they're going to need to really come out all guns blazing. Now, I think there's absolutely scope for a major June and a big September Direct. Given the accelerated pace of Nintendo's release schedule this year, I think there are conservatively a half dozen unrevealed slots for the rest of the year, and Nintendo generally likes to shore up its holiday window fairly early, so it is possible that we could see Metroid as part of a broader Direct. But given all the strange going on this year with prices, with GTA 6, an alternative strategy would be to make Metroid the centerpiece of their August, do a Fire Emblem's Fortune Weave Direct, perhaps to date that to late September so that it will ride the Zelda wave, and then have a massive Zelda-focused Direct on the 1st of September to showcase their lineup for the rest of the financial year, starting with Ocarina of Time on the 1st of October. In terms of forecasting then, using my traditional percentage bands so that I can review my accuracy periodically, I will add the following forecasts at this point. 90% a new Metroid game is announced by the end of 2027. 70% a new Metroid game is announced by the end of 2026. 70% Metroid is mentioned in some form this year, Direct, Nintendo Today, Drop, etc. 50% a Metroid Direct or Metroid Focus section of a Direct happens this year. A new Mercury Steam Metroid is announced, and 50% a new Mercury Steam Metroid is announced. 30% we get a bespoke Metroid Direct entirely. Some kind of new version of older Metroid returns, a Samus Returns port, a Pixel Remaster, Metroid 40, and also 30% a Metroid movie project is announced this year. Just 10% a Metroid movie-based project is announced by the end of 2027, either now to ride the Metroid hype window or potentially in the follow-up to a hopefully successful Zelda film when they will be looking for other kinds of properties to pivot to. A Metroid-based toy or mobile app releasing this year, I think, is just 10%, and 10% of there being news of a Metroid movie by the end of 2026. For more on potential big announcements from Nintendo, including likelihoods around a Nintendo Direct, check back soon, and also do check out the Patreon for a video on Metroid Prime 2 and what could happen in terms of a remastered game, as well as a separate podcast which deep dives the potential for Nintendo to do some kind of Bonanza-style ground-up reinvention of Metroid. Plus, of course, there's other exclusive early and ad-free content. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.